I'd like to take the time today. People do different presentations. You do your teaching presentation. You do your I don't know what's going on, tell me presentation. You do your collaborative one. I'd like this one to be a time to think for big ideas. I think sometimes in academia, we have this amazing privilege and right to take on big ideas. And oftentimes, we have the ability to do it where many other sectors have to worry about different bottom line issues and different constituency issues. And I'm afraid that oftentimes we don't take advantage of the position that we have. So I want to take on some big ideas. And I want to think about big ideas. The picture, if you may not know, it's a little dull here, but this is the picture of the academy. And what I love about it is where the word academy comes from, which is that it was a gym in Greece. Sort of an outdoor garden, and Plato would go work out and then sort of hang out in the corner and talk to people about the meaning of life. And so I love the idea that sort of Western thought was born in a YMCA. That just seems so true, doesn't it? But I want it means that you play with ideas, you think about ideas, you work around ideas. And I want to do that today. And I want to take the idea to think about big ideas. And we're going to build up to them, though. You can't just start from scratch. So let's build up to them. And I'm going to just walk you through some ideas that we had and sort of show you what the implications are. So we've been working now for over a year on this concept of participatory networks, the library's conversation. It's a technology brief we put out last year, and it's gotten sort of a life on its own. And Carrie talked a little bit about where it came from, which was this policy movement on social networking, which is when Congress went to say, social networks are dangerous and we should keep them out of our libraries and out of our schools, it necessitated an answer to a question, which is now, what is a social network again? And what do you mean a social networking site? And we can't call it the We Don't Like MySpace Act because that's not going to work. So they really had a hard time defining this stuff and, in fact, ended up with interactive website. But at the same time, libraries and library directors and library boards were having this issue. OCLC just came out with a very large report on, they called it on privacy, but they said because we wanted to do it on social networking and didn't know what to call it, we called it privacy. And then they said, well, now we have social networks and we have social media sites. And so, we did what everyone starts to do when they get this wonderful little, here, write a paper thing, which is we started with a really bad dictionary. This is what a mashup is, and this is what a this is, and this is what a that is. And it still, unfortunately, exists in that program. But we really wanted to look past the sort of functions and doodads and whizzes and gadgets and see what's durable here. What are the concepts? What's going on? The idea that things are just social, or that we are social animals, is a very unsatisfying answer for why Web 2.0 got as much attention as it has. Why? What's going on here? Why are people pushing for this? And we ended up with a series of challenges and recommendations. But the why that we ended up with, I hope, there we go. We looked around and we ended up looking at a very interesting, if long-winded academic from England. He's dead now, so we can pick on him. A fellow by the name of Gordon Pask. And those of you who are long enough to remember the days of cybernetics and cyberneticians might remember Pask. And Pask, they called him the cybernetician, which, God, could print that on a card would be just fun. And what he did was he was really interested in artificial intelligence and getting machines to think, and he thought that a good place to start might be in how people think. Or as we say, we're going to use natural intelligence until artificial intelligence catches up. So he looked and he said, all right, what's going on here? What's happening? And he came around that knowledge creation, learning, is a product of conversation. Now, he's a very precise definition of conversation, which is the interaction between two cognizing agents. So at his time, he was thinking that could be two people, that could be two groups, that could be two societies, two organizations. It can be within the individual. Those of you who may be familiar with the instruction world are familiar with things like critical thinking, metacognition, the idea of talking to yourself, preferably not out loud in public places, but we do it all the time. And so if we take this idea that knowledge is created through conversation, and this goes through scaffolding and lots of learning theory about the idea of we come to agreements and then we base new agreements upon them and we build knowledge. If libraries are in the knowledge business, they're in the conversation business. Right? I think very few libraries would stand up and say, we're not in the knowledge business. We are in the book inventory business. Clearly, we are in the big buildings with lots of ivy business. No, no, no. We are in the whatever. We're in the knowledge business. And if knowledge has created the conversation, we're in the conversation business. Now, this has some pretty interesting impacts. Things like artifacts are secondary objects. Now, that's metadata talk. What does it mean? It means that books and videos and web pages and things that we produce out of a knowledge process are inherently second class to the knowledge creation. They're an imperfect representation of the knowledge created. Doesn't mean they're unimportant. Doesn't mean they're useless. Doesn't mean they don't have utility. It means they're secondary to the act of knowledge creation. And we know this, and we know how hard it is if you look at the area of knowledge management. Knowledge management has struggled for years because they are stuck with secondary objects. You hear it discussed in terms of tacit knowledge versus formal knowledge versus structural knowledge, and how do we build knowledge bases in virtual reference environments, and what do we do with QA systems, and how do we make these databases meaningful, and what do you mean an abstract isn't good enough to find data? Certainly good enough for an undergraduate to cite a paper. I come from an ERIC clearinghouse. We know that no one goes past the abstract. And that includes me. No, knowledge is about learning. That's the other part of this. That they're useful, but it's about the conversation. And as technology is caught up, we're able to get closer and closer to the point of knowledge creation and the structure of knowledge creation. And that's fascinating and powerful. The other thing that we know from education theory and lots of other things is that knowledge is about learning, not dissemination. Simply making information available or passing out information or putting information in front of someone is insufficient for knowledge. It is a necessary but insufficient act. That in fact knowledge is an active participatory process. If you're going to learn, you must be active in that process. I wish it weren't so. I wish all those tapes that I play as I go to sleep would teach me how to play the piano, but they don't. So what does that mean? Well, what that's done is it's created a very interesting pressure, a pressure to participate in the knowledge creation process. And when we look at social networks, what we like to talk about participatory systems, partially because social has a lot of baggage to it, what we look at is this pressure. People, if they need to be active constructors of their knowledge, they want tools that allow and facilitate conversation and participation. When they approach a tool, they can use it, they can gather data from it, but ultimately they are going to have a somewhat unsatisfying interaction with systems because they can't shape it. They can't control it. They can't build ownership in it. And we've talked about this for a long time, user-based system. We've sort of moved from system design to user-based systems, and I would argue we're quickly moving to user systems. We're not basing them on users. The users are building them around us. Because ultimately, Andy Dillon at Texas likes to talk about the idea that user-based is an irrelevant concept. He says it doesn't mean anything anymore. Not that it's useless, but the idea is everyone can say they're user-based. I talked to a user. It's user-based. Did you listen to the user? I talked to the user. That's good enough, right? So how do we build these kind of user systems? How do we evidence this pressure for the hierarchy? Well, I want you to think about the internet as an example. And what I want you to do is I want you to break the internet down from just that big blob of the interwebs with the tubes to talk about things like at the base level you have an infrastructure. You have the wires. I mean, you know, my engineering background. We got wires. Doesn't work, you need more wires. Now it's wireless and we're a little in trouble. Right? On top of that infrastructure we build applications to move data around it. Your web pages, your web servers, these kinds of things. On top of those applications, we add information to it, right? So I build a web page with my data using these web server tools that goes over this infrastructure to go to someone else's tools, which goes to the top level, which is use. I then take this data and I apply it. I put it into some sort of practice. We can see, looking at the internet, evidence of this pressure for participation at each level. Big waves. Look at the infrastructure. If you look at the infrastructure of wide area networks, the development of them over the past 20, 30 years, I'm getting older, so I got to keep adding decades. The notion of a participatory infrastructure is not a given. If you think about it, the internet is a network of networks. It's a series of agreements where the only thing we agree on is TCP/IP. We don't agree on much more than that. We can filter what we don't want. We can change the bandwidth and the capacity. We can do all this stuff. It's participatory. The people who join the network help shape the network. Well, if you remember the good old days of Prodigy and CompuServe and AOL as it used to be, that was not a participatory infrastructure. You don't like your bandwidth? Thanks for coming. Go somewhere else, right? The idea of you want to add a network? Sorry, you can add a client. The idea of where's the POP and what's the phone number? This wasn't a participatory system, and what we've seen over the years is those wide area networks have frankly either disappeared or radically changed their model, such as AOL is now a service provider. We can see this pressure moving up this hierarchy to application builders. Certainly the open source movement, the philosophy, not simply the act of putting source code online, represents participation in tools. You don't like the tool? Build your own. You want a different email package? Create a marketplace. You don't like what's out there? Create your own. Even the idea of how do we know it's good software has changed from it came from a reputable shop to the community had a chance to whack on it, we can't find any more errors. This is the Linux mentality. And in online voting, this philosophy comes right to the front. Right? Online voting, Diebold says, we're a good shop, you should trust us, we have a lot of security, we produce good things, that's the way you should vote. I'm not going to make any political comments. I just did. Like, I'm such a hidden Democrat, no one would ever know. But versus the open source community says, that's nuts. We can break it. We can break this and we can break that and we break it and we don't even let us and we can break it. Good Lord, you're putting this in the hands of Catherine Harris. What are you thinking? Right? But their philosophy is the more people see it, the more people can participate in the process, the higher the quality of product. We're now at the point where this pressure has come to the information services where people come up and say, what do you mean I can't comment on your content? What do you mean I can't reshape it and put it on a map? What do you mean that I can't give you my information and put my own photos on here and grab this data and blog about it and discuss it? Right? This is, for example, you see this in an interesting setting. You see this in things like education. In education, where students in K-12 schools had their internet access filtered, they said, forget this. And they figured out proxy services to get around them. And not only that, but they said, I'm going to create my own website that's going to tell you how crappy your website is. Right? So WalmartSucks.com comes about. Because this thing is open, because people went to Walmart and were dissatisfied and Walmart didn't give them the tools to participate in that site and that content, people simply created alternate methods to do it. This pressure, now what does Walmart do? Do they simply pretend it doesn't exist? Do they acknowledge it? And you see more and more companies say, we need to have them under the same tent and we need to allow them to shape and change the information we work in. This is where libraries sit right now. And then at the use level, which we're not going to spend too much time, but some of the work I also do is in credibility, which is who are you to tell me what's good information? Right? Who are you? Right? And if you look at the Katrina excitement, ... political statement here, ... you look at what happened where residents of the 9th Ward were coming in and they were trying to get official credible information from FEMA and they weren't getting the same information twice from the same person. They weren't able to determine what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's not. Authority as a method of determining credible information had broken down and dissolved. And what happened? They went to the web and they went to sites like NOLA.com, and NOLA.com had basic, talk about life in New Orleans stuff, turned it into a neighborhood discussion, and people started saying, this is what I heard and it worked. Try this and try this. And they created experts of the community who were giving them consistent information over and over again. It was a whole different way of determining credibility. Not from where you come from, but by the accuracy of the statements you make. Radical concept. So, what I want to now look at really quickly are the implications of some of these ideas of participation as they look in sort of library land. And I want to look in 3 different settings. I want to look at the area of reference, because, that's me, and look at physical settings. And then I want to hone in and talk about what I think the impact is in terms of education, LIS education specifically, but I think general context. So let's look at reference. The current model of reference. One could argue that reference is already participatory. You have people, you're asking questions, it's participatory. What's clearly a conversation in a library? And yet, if you look at the model that we based virtual reference on, it's this model. It's the big head behind the big desk. So instead of, on our websites, instead of that desk being built out of wood, it's built out of code. But it's still sitting on the library's website that the user comes to. It's still a person sitting behind that desk. What's very interesting is there's nothing inherent in any of the definitions of reference or virtual reference that says it's a one-to-one interaction. And yet, every piece of software that's been built has been built for one-to-one interaction. A librarian talking to a patron. Now, there are lots of reasons for this, coming everywhere from staffing down to privacy, but no one's really challenged it. So let's look at some of the problems with the current reference model. It's library-centered. You come into my space, you use my tools, question point, tutor, whatever you want. By the way, mine, as the librarians, are actually better than your tools, because I can do things like push pages and scripts and all this other stuff, and I control the page pushing. Right? I'm going to lead you around. It puts the librarians into a very awkward spot. It assumes that librarians are content experts. When you walk up and you have a question, if you look at the data, it's startling. And I mean the data over like 50 years looking at the data of reference. The disconnect between when a librarian considers something answered and when a patron considers something answered is orders of magnitude off. Why? Because the user is expecting a piece of content that can change their life, and the librarian considers the answer teaching them the tools and methods to get at that information so they can evaluate it themselves. It's a philosophical debate that I don't want to get down into the middle of, but it's still a very awkward spot. We have to decide, do we educate the user to agree with our definition, or do we go down to their level to give them the answer? What is that? But it also is a matter of when I ask a question out of ignorance, I'm assuming the person I'm asking a question knows more than I do on the topic. And what's interesting is librarians don't. We don't train them to know more on the topic. We train them to be very good at determining the problem and coming up with solutions. But we don't necessarily tell the users that. Once again, assumes one-to-one, and oftentimes it is divorced from the locus of learning. When Toronto Public Library built this massive computer commons in their new downtown library, they were amazed that their virtual reference traffic spiked. Because what happens is people no longer had to leave the computers they were on to ask a librarian a question. They could be right there at the spot. And we really need to get past the idea that being on a computer on the desktop is sufficient. People want us to be in the catalog, in their Word application, in their problem. So people have to sort of stop, cognitively stop what they're thinking about, formulate a question, go to a new system which is housed by the library, talk to a librarian, get the answer, come back and reassimilate it. That's a lot of cognitive load for someone. So what does it look like then if we were to redesign it? How would we redesign reference? He hopes he knows. First of all, the user has to be in control. Not based on the user, not assimilation of the user, it's the user. It's all about learning. It's all about learning. Libraries are learning organizations, and learning is a collaborative conversation. It's about dialogue, not about dissemination, not about pushing. Now, I'm going to run through a demonstration on a product we called Scapes. A concept we called Scapes. If you want to hear the longer version, that's on the website where you'll find these slides as well. So I'm going to walk you through. When we looked at Question Point and we sat down and said, what's version 2 of Question Point look like? This is what we came up with. This is literally what we came up with. All right. That's what we came up with. The idea is, rather than thinking of the metaphor of walking up to the desk, and I used to talk about, and I'm sure everyone does, the sort of unnatural act of reference, where you ask someone to come up to a complete stranger, invade their personal space, and go, "Hi, I'm stupid. Can you help me?" Right? Now imagine the metaphor is, instead of a desk, imagine it as a workspace, a table. And what happens at that table is you don't start by admitting your ignorance. You start at that table, maybe you have a question, but maybe you already have a sense of how it works. And you begin at that table to organize the information. Well, this books are related over here, this is related information, and you begin laying out the resources you're looking at. And you might invite other people, a librarian, a friend, in to look at that, but it's your space that you're controlling. So let's look at how that might work. So I'm going to go ahead. I listened to this cool piece of music, and I had this really horrible dysfunction that was put into my head by Jesuits in high school, which is I cannot listen to songs without analyzing the lyrics of music, which drives my wife nuts. She's like, "Oh, this is such a great song." I'm like, "Do you realize it's about bestiality?" "What? No." Anyway, so very few songs about bestiality, by the way. Just a few. So I'm going to start by I heard this great song. I'm going to go look up this song, so I do a quick search. I'm going to search for Rich Girl by Gwen Stefani. I'm going to talk about this menu right now. Obviously, it's just ripped off from Apple's Spotlight, but we'll get into this in a second. And here's the song, and I'll just drag that song out onto my space. I'm hip and jiggy with it. All right, that's good enough. So I got the song. Right? And libraries, you can argue, would be pretty good with currently how we do things about getting the song. But I drag that in. And I can click on that song just like I could otherwise. And I'll find that that song has a couple of facets to it. These are sort of built-in bibliographic facets. I know the artists. I know the albums. I know the release date. Right? So these are connections. I can now connect this artifact, this thing, to other artifacts. So I'll just, for example, grab the album here. And I know that this is of this album. And I'm physically laying out the relationship of these ideas in my head. And I say, well, that's really interesting. I need to bring in some help on here because I'm sort of stuck. There's something bothering me. I know I've heard the song before. And I'm going to bring up my friends here. I'm going to bring up, maybe I have IM colleagues, homework help, and here's this typical Ask a Librarian question. I'm going to pick on my friend Jeff Penka. And I'm going to say, invite Jeff into my scape, my world. And I'm going to say, hey, Jeff, I know... do you know where I can find lyrics for the song? He says, sure, hold on. He goes to the same tools at the same space and does the same search. Right? And so he looks for lyrics and he finds it. And he's going to say, here's someone who did another one of these already on this lyrics. I'll bring that in. And sure enough, he drags it in. And if you look at it, there are the lyrics. But what's interesting is because this isn't just an object. This was someone else's sort of conversation view of the world. I not only have the lyrics here, but they've broken out certain of these lyrics that sort of make you scratch your head and analyze them. So for example, mine, I'm in my Galliano ground, or this one. I get me 4 Harajuka girls to and I say, what? Right? And what they've done in their conversation that I've now attached to mine is I can say, oh, these 4 Harajuka girls are Stefani's backup dancers. And in fact, if you go to this Wikipedia site, you can find out it's actually named after a metro stop in Japan that's known for its stylish and colorful outfits. Right? So now I have a relationship that my typical bibliographic, if I only look at an object world, doesn't get me. I have these relationships going on, and I can connect them. And I can say, that's cool, but I know I've heard this somewhere before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my friends. Jeff's useless. I'm going to go ahead and ask a librarian, invite them into my space, and say, you know, hi, do you know if this song is a remake? Hold on. It's actually a remake of the Fiddler on the Roof song. But when that librarian comes in, rather than starting with, have you looked in Google, which is the most insulting reference answer you can give. Because the answer is always, well, duh. Right? So they, instead of starting with, well, what have you looked before? Or the famous thing we need to teach reference librarians how to ask the question, why do you need to know this? But we're never actually allowed to use the phrase, why do you need to know this? Well, now they can quickly say, look, they can scan it. Right? So when I say this song, they don't have to say, what song, you idiot? They go, oh, that song. Right? They have the scape in front of them. They have context. And so now they can say, it's actually a remake of the song. I'll go ahead and add the information about the remake. They bring up a series of tools for that last little thing. They add these things, and I end up with, this is a version of If I Were a Rich Man from Fiddler on the Roof, and here's the list of Fiddler on the Roof. Right? So now I have this relationship building. Right? That I have artifacts here, but it's my space, and I'm organizing the world how I want to see it. And so while someone may never think of Yenti somehow connecting to Rich Girl by Gwen Stefani, if they found this conversation, they could actually find that linkage. And so we say, great, that's great. We all sign off. We all go away. Now, the other thing that I think is a red herring discussion in reference is real-time versus asynchronous versus email versus whatever. Well, Jeff is driving by, and he hears a song that night that says, oh, you know what? She also remade a sound from Sound of Music. He can come back into the scape, and he can add this information. Wind it up. There's not enough yodeling in pop music today. Right? So it comes from Sound of Music. So now if we sort of turn this around for a minute and we take a look at what's behind the scenes here, right? He was able to come into this scape. I can make it a social event. Right? If I allow ownership, anyone could come. Or I could say only my friends or only the people who are part of the discussion. Right? But let's look at what's happening behind the scenes. What I have behind the scenes is I have the stuff. Right? I've got the song, And I've got, these different objects, people, the text that they use in discussion, the text, the lyrics, web pages, CDs, bibliographic data. I've got these objects that may have come from very disparate sources. Some might be sitting on my hard drive, some may be owned by the library, some are on Wikipedia, what have you. But what's more importantly, because a lot of where we stop in an object fixation of a profession is there. I have the relationships of all of those things together. I know that this person was talking about this song and said this. I know that these people were somehow connected in this setting. I know that this is now, you get this whole new view of life that has nothing to do with the Dewey Decimal Classification. Dewey and LC are conversations. Dewey and LC at their best are a way of answering the question, how do you organize the world? But they're only one. I now have Dave's view of this. Right? I have Dave's view. I may have Dewey's view behind this, Library of Congress. And with that kind of related data, yeah, I can pop it into this cool little visual interface. But I have the data, I have the structures, I could have the same conversation on a cell phone. Why not? So instead of starting by logging in, I send SMS text messages, and boom, I'm having a brief conversation. And then if it gets too complicated or later after I've had initial conversation, all this data is still being constructed. Now I can go do the visual one when I'm at home or when I have more time. Or I can come in and interface with it later in this way. Or I can connect it into Blackboard or a learning management system. In fact, this isn't too far from a learning management system. Right? If you look at learning management systems, you guys Blackboard, WebCT, or other? Blackboard, aren't we all? We'll just have the abused child conversation later. Right, we're constructing knowledge. And if you look at that, we set up these wonderful structures, and then people run to the bulletin boards where they have the real interesting, meaty conversation because they can shape the bulletin boards. Right? Or I could have this show up in an IM window. Why not? And I mentioned before we come back to the mystery drop-down box. Where does this come from? Well, this comes from the collection and amalgamation of all of these. So what pops up to the top? Well, how about the thing that's most linked to? Right? Google PageRank, but this time for objects and not just web pages. Right? What is See Also? Where do these little items pop up from? These other relationships. 9 out of 10 people found that if you bring in this resource is interesting. Or this is a topical linkage, this is a author linkage, this is whatever. And you can begin to organize the data and turn it into an interesting retrieval matrix. And we can have some people working, I have a doctoral student working right now on the idea of how do you build retrieval engines when you can do predictive algorithms because you have sequential data to work with. But I won't go there because even I nerd myself out there. So that's a reference view when we take this idea of participation. Now, we also had this interesting challenge. We looked at reserve systems and we looked at catalogs. Catalogs are going to be fun to fix. And we got a call from the Free Library of Philadelphia, so 5 blocks that way, right? Whatever. And in case you didn't know, in case they haven't called you for money yet, they're busy building a $175 million addition to the Central Library. And apparently they can't issue a bond issue, which I think is even better. So they've got to raise it off. And what happens is they said, we've got this great building, we're ready, what do we put into it? Because when we laid out the designs, they said, all right, here it is. Wonderful, $175 million addition happens once every 100 years. This is our chance. What do you want to do? And people said, well, we'll move the books from here over to here. We'll put compact shelving all over here. And the people who had to go get the money were going, you're kidding me, right? Well, we have 9 million volumes. We got to cram them somewhere. And so they said, let's help us think about what is a participatory physical space. And so the first group we met with a group of venture capitalists and entrepreneurs, and we said, what does the library look like to you? And they said, number one thing we need, FedEx Kinko's. Number 2, a place to meet. Number 3, basic computing facility and information to come up. Number 4, video conferencing in a boardroom, right? Oh, and a couple of resources would be helpful as well. And what they looked at is they began designing a space around how do we promote entrepreneurship. The idea is to have a conversation, and economic development, I'm guessing, is somewhat of an important conversation in Philadelphia, because it is everywhere else. And so they said, how can the library help in economic development? They looked at, they said, the number one unserved economic development community are entrepreneurs and startups. And what they need is they need a place to go start up, not a place to read about other people who have started up. We want a proactive center. We want a physical space. We want to take people on field trips. We want them to come in and go out of the library, record it, and bring it back. We want mentoring experience. So they called it the entrepreneurium. We talked to writers. Writers, we said, what do writers want from a library? And they said, we want two spaces. We want one very quiet space that we can write, and we want a salon where we can look at literary magazines, hang out, and meet people for our work groups, our writing groups. And we want ongoing curricula in poetry writing and in prose writing. We want workshops. Yeah, literature would be helpful to have there too, but what we're learning is that it's about the tools for producing knowledge, not the artifacts that were produced through a formal process that are important. We talked to musicians. We said we have an excellent music library. The Free Library of Philadelphia has an incredible music library, particularly in chamber music. Best in the country, best in the world in some ways. So we talked to musicians. The first thing they wanted, a stage with 2 grand pianos. In a library? Yes. They wanted performance space. They said what's very interesting in the classical art world, the publishing industry has been destroyed. There is no publishing model for scores of classical music and new music these days. Doesn't exist. What we want is we want to be able to come into a library. We want to be able to practice and compose. We want to then be able to perform, because the performance is what we care about. And while we're doing it, you're welcome to record it, and we'll hand it off to you, and you can make it available to anyone in the world. Forget RIAA, forget all that. There is no copyright. If anything goes out, it's great. And so the idea is that then a classical musician could come in and say, I need to put on a performance with 3 horns and a drum. And it could say, here's the score, listen to it directly, put it back in, here's a discussion of it, and build this conversation around a piece of music. So when we look at how does a library serve a community, the idea was to look at the community and run the community. By the way, become a publisher of the community. Very interesting thing happened too is we asked, how would you manage this space? These folks want a board. They want a board that can lay down policy and discuss it. These folks want an email list for a couple of writers, so as the librarian has a good idea, they can shoot it by him. These folks want a musical curator. They want someone who sort of manages that performance space that they're building as part of the new and say, this is worth putting on, this is it, we want to increase diversity, and have someone with taste that they trust that talks about how information goes in and out of that collection. All right? But the point of this is, it's not just about where to put the next 8 million volumes. The point of this is a community, and a library facilitates the conversations of a community to derive knowledge. And it does so by meeting the norms of the community, not by simply adding more resources to the community and hoping it helps. So what did we learn from here? Well, here's the user's control, all about learning, collaborative, that the library serves as the facilitator of a conversation. That it's the library's role to identify these communities and work with these communities to build their own knowledge. And I want to be really clear here. Facilitation is not becomes transparent and gets out of the way. A good facilitator has an independent voice and independent information that they can bring to the setting. One of the things we talked about in terms of ethics of this is the notion of non-biased is a ridiculous notion that we need to get rid of. The idea that librarians are in some way non-biased is ridiculous. The idea that any community can be non-biased is ridiculous. You have biases. You are human. You have experiences and perspectives that will impact what you do. The very act of when you're asked a reference question, whether you turn to start typing or when you reach for a book, is a bias. The very act of asking, why do you need this information, is a bias. Bias is not bad. Joe Janes did this. We were working on quality standards for a virtual reference consortium, and he's the one who said, non-biased is irrelevant. Forget it. It doesn't exist. What you want is you want equal biases in the aggregate. We talked about this. I have a standing fight with my advisor, former advisor, Mike Eisenberg, who says that the best thing in the world would be if librarians rebuilt Google. And I say, that's ridiculous. And he says, imagine the cool website you could get if librarians picked the best stuff on the internet. I said, it would be crap. He doesn't like that. And I said, librarians have no special or unique ability to pick good and bad. He didn't like that at all. And I said, it would be like saying, I want janitors to pick the next one. Why? Right? I want doctors to pick the next one. I want whatever community you can pick. I said what makes librarians special from all those other communities is that they don't answer from their own perspective. They answer from the perspective of a user. That what makes a librarian special is not that they know good information or bad information. What makes a librarian special is they know what's good and bad information for your need. And it may be different than your need. And it may be different, right? This is a reporter walks up to a librarian, sounds like a bad joke. A reporter walks up to a librarian and says, I need good information on hate sites on the internet. And hate groups using the internet for recruiting. Ku Klux Klan website, Stormfront. You can name all these. They're great resources. Fourth grader walks up, asks for good after-school programs. Well, there's the Ku Klux Klan website, and right? It's ridiculous. Right? What's the difference between good and bad of those? The query, the user, the context, the conversation. And so when we turn around and represent these artifacts as if context didn't matter, it's ridiculous. Dewey, by simply organizing things in Dewey Decimal, is well documented that you are organizing by something that started out as a misogynist, anti-Semite from upstate New York. Right? That's what Dewey was. If you go look for religion, look for any obscure Christian text and the number's about that big. Look for like the Talmud and the number's this big. Right? Why? Because he had a point of view. He had a bias. It embedded in that conversation. Because he tried to create, right or wrongly, a material that would cover all conversations in all contexts. And it's never going to work. We need to learn to, true facilitation means shared ownership. This is fun. Invest in tools for creation over collection of artifacts. Give them the tools to build, don't give them the books. Now, let's turn this on ourselves and look at how we prepare people for this. These are some quotes from very smart people, some familiar. Not going there. About when I asked them what's the mission of libraries these days. The mission of a library, according to the University of Kentucky, is to improve decision-making to improve people's lives. I would like that one. That's a good one. David Fensky, that libraries need to engage in larger societal issues and conversations and grand themes. Kimberly Kelly, who was the new dean, she was in the job for all of 2 months before I interrogated her, said she had a very interesting experience. She talked to basically catalogers and tech services in the Potomac Valley, and they said the curriculum that we currently have teaches students to objects and it must teach past the object. What we're teaching students to do is how to apply metadata to a thing. What we need them to understand is this thing is part of a much larger conversation. And unless you understand the much larger conversation this thing comes from, you're never going to be particularly good at applying description to it. And I like this one. The highest priority is to prepare students for a vital field that is dynamic and always changing. So Larry, let's get into think big, but not think hype. This is not a 2.0 discussion. The ta-da at the end of this is we all need to be in education 2.0. Because the problem with any 2.0 discussion, from education 2.0 to web 2.0 to library 2.0 to shoe salesman 2.0 to whatever 2.0. I mean, come on, we've been around for a couple of thousand years. Couldn't we be at least library 12.5 beta? It's not a product of new features, but a recognition of new societal needs and capabilities. The reason we need to talk about how to reinvent libraries and look at libraries, and we'll need to do it again in 100 years, is that life is different now than it was. When libraries first became public libraries, the idea was literacy. But it wasn't to teach people how to read. It was to give them access to the right literature. And there was a strong bias in there of Edwardian male white power class say this is what you should be reading. And we've changed. And our libraries have changed. What we need to think about in education is how do we prepare for what I consider a Dewey level shift in libraries. Dewey level. I mean, when you look at the impact Dewey had on libraries, I think we're at that level, that libraries are going to look that different afterwards. From artifacts and items to knowledge and relationships. That instead of training people to go into a setting and organize materials or answer questions about materials, we need to teach people how to walk into a setting and be facilitators. They need to provide access to information and knowledge. So we need to get them to a conversation. Yes?
You threw out continuously broad alignment in the artifacts and tools, and I can understand that why you're emphasizing the role of tools as versus artifacts, in the sense that I think you consider artifacts as a kind of finished, complete, and not changing something, products, final products.
Mm-hmm.
But even during your demonstration of the scrapes program, I think the reason you could draw the kind of relationships and connections was not just because you have the tool, the technical tool, but because you could have those artifacts, not just in, okay, you have a lot of products, I mean, knowledge product, but also because you have the meta product that describe the product in certain ways. That's why you could draw connections.
Artifacts are not unimportant and not irrelevant. They're simply secondary. And what that means is, and they can be a real close second, but the idea is, if I put up a picture, we had this situation, I wish I had it here. If I put up a picture, it's a nice picture, woman, brown hair, scarf, late teens, early 20s. It's a picture. If I tell you that that picture is in fact of a Syracuse University student, it has a different perspective to it. Oh, okay, Syracuse University. If I say that that student was a Syracuse University perspective that took advantage of the overseas study program in the early 90s, okay, that's fine. If I then tell you that student was blown up in an airplane over Lockerbie, Scotland from a terrorist, that picture takes on a whole different context. It's still a picture. The picture's still important. The picture's still useful. But what makes it really interesting, and what makes it really powerful, and what makes it part of a learning object is the context that we put around the artifact. It's not that the artifacts aren't important. It's the fact that the connections of those artifacts to context is what's increasingly important, and what is increasingly is often overlooked in library contexts.
Yes, but those products, I mean, artifacts put in certain context, are themselves also artifacts, and what I want to say is actually artifacts themselves actually serve as tools.
Yes, you're right. So, how do we enable for digital library conversations? I think the first thing we need to talk about is how we teach change management and not leadership. I should put not just leadership. We face a very dysfunctional innovation process in libraries, in public libraries, academic libraries, special libraries, and that is we hire the new students, often referred to as the young students, because they know the more stuff. And unfortunately, oftentimes that means we hire them so we don't have to know the new stuff. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been in organizations like, oh, this is really cool, we got to run it by Becky or Fred or Sue or Bob. Why? Because we just hired them and they're really smart. And then we say, all right, congratulations, it's your first job. And we even prepared that person with a grand vision of how society should be. They listen to Dave and they believe this is it. We've even given them great skills and tools. So they walk into their first job where they don't know the culture, they have no status, and they have no seniority, and they're in an increasingly conservative environment, and we say, go! And what happens is they smash their head against the wall and they leave. Or they suffer through it, or their skills get out of date, or whatever it is. Because we've given them the vision of where they need to be. We've even given them the tools to get there, except we haven't told them that, in fact, pardon my language, they're going to encounter some assholes along the way, and they better figure out how to deal with that. Right? So we need to be teaching change management, and increasingly that needs to happen in real-world settings to do it. You have practica. We do it through co-ops. We do it through internships. But we don't necessarily do enough of it. This is the issue that we have with an education system that assumes we can train librarians in 2.5 years with no continuing education afterwards. We all know that's a problem. But the problem is that we have a relatively frictionless environment for them to learn in. When someone comes up with a brilliant idea, they write a paper about it, they get a good grade, and it goes away. What happens to the sustainability? What happens with how we do it? Well, that's all right, we teach them in a management class. But what we need to worry about how, as a profession, we're only a small part of that we can continually engage in change management and radical change management. And we need to drink the Kool-Aid and eat our own dog food. These are horrible phrases, but we'll stick with them. That we need to recognize that there has been a shift in innovation in our field, concentrated in the academy, to now being distributed throughout the practice and other industries. This is new. It used to be that you would go to library school to learn the latest. Now the latest is popping out all over the world. That we need to model co-learning in the classroom. One of the frustrations I have as a faculty member, and I've encountered others, is that we don't have enough time to update our own skills. Right? I'm on sabbatical this year, thank God. So in 7 years I can refresh my skills again. Right? what we need to be able to do is have students come in the classroom and go, by the way, guys, I know half of what we're going to learn this semester, and I'll be learning the other half with you. And that will be technology or theory or application or change management or what have you. And that's a big pressure. And a lot of us do it. The best of us do this now. But it's hard. Also, we exist in a setting where I started by talking about big ideas. Let's face it, the academic success model is often through reductionism. That if you're not the biggest person in your field, you split the field. Right? So I'm not a reference researcher. I'm a digital reference researcher. Oh, too many people in that pool. I'm not just into digital reference. I'm into systems view of digital reference. No, I'm into this. And we keep reducing it down until I'm the biggest person in my pool. And then we try and sell NSF and IMLS and whatever that that's the most important question ever to ask. And we have a hard time of building that back up. And I think iSchools do a better job of this than most other schools of integrating these individual areas into a larger synthesis. But I think oftentimes we don't do that. In library science, when we talk to a lot of faculty about are you having discussions about what the mission of a library is today, they say, we talk about that in 511. Our students talk about that. Does it ever bubble up? I mean, I'll stand up first. Syracuse University has not had the what is the role and mission of a library in society discussion today as a faculty at our faculty planning day, right? But we should. And we should have it of knowledge management and these other sectors and the information school on a regular basis. So we need to recognize that we have a role of this, that we are our own participatory network, and we need to transition from being schools to schools of thought. This is a big one that I get really intellectual signatures, not mottos. I was talking to one person, I said, what is your intellectual signature? And they said, we connect people to information. I said, that's not a signature, it's a motto. This is one of those times when you really should have self-edited. But, you know, Syracuse, let's see, what is ours? We empower people through information. Drexel? Gone.
So we're a faculty of one.
Oh yeah, faculty of one, yeah. One big happy family, faculty of one. Right? But we oftentimes, you know, why is it that the world is a better place because Drexel is here in 2008? What is the school of thought that means that a Drexel student coming out of here has a unique perspective that they apply in all different settings? Now we can say what is an iSchool student and we can say all this other stuff, but what's really important is that ultimately we are here to work together to that answer and not necessarily as these independent agents that share apparently increasing office space by the minute. So we have an obligation for leadership as faculty and as students and as librarians. I worked hard at figuring this out. It's not aspirations to leadership. It's not a desire for leadership. It's not, oh, I want to be a leader of this or this. It's an obligation. It's a stewardship challenge. That first of all, we have an obligation to innovate from core principles. Meaning, I really, really worry that libraries, as an example, are chasing Google so fast that we've never stopped to ask if we're in the same business. That we try and be Amazon-like when we don't know if we're in the same business. And what happens is, when you get into this adoption cycle, you will always be in this second place at best. You'll always be the second best Google or the second best, because they know their business, or at least they try and figure it out. I'm not convinced that libraries are in the search engine business. In fact, I would argue they're not. They're not in the book selling business, and they're not in the book warehousing business. What is it that we're doing, and what's our unique contribution? It's the obligation of LIS education to facilitate this discussion, defining leadership. It's not going to happen in the profession. OITP has an area to do it. Great. One initiative. We influence the next generation. We are a lever point for the whole field. If LIS education doesn't take up this mantle of talking about what's next, what's happening, then we lose an amazing opportunity. We need to accept this obligation of leadership. It is the LIS school not to produce spare parts. Betty died. Bring in the next Betty. Right? It is not to further a research agenda into microbes. Only if that further research helps us with a larger societal goal and mission. Ultimately, it is the obligation of our schools, our students, to produce change agents that will on a regular basis go through, define what a profession is, advance the profession, and improve the communities they work in. And ultimately to improve society for being part of it. Now, that's not to say you have to do that in a non-for-profit setting, and that's not to say you have to do it in a physical building called a library, but it is an obligation that we must take on with every student. To say, you come here you accept a mission. If you accept this scholarship, accept this position, give us tuition money, you accept an obligation to improve society today. And we'll do our part by facilitating that conversation and having that conversation and not ignoring that conversation. But you have to do your part by, once you get out of here, fixing it. And we'll be there too. I was going through, one last story, I was going through in Florence. I went to the Academy where they have the David, and they took us into this amazing sculpture area. And you looked at these gorgeous busts of heads and faces and everything. And the tour guide said, that's the problem. What? And you look at it, he goes, that wall is the problem. It was the problem with Florentine art. I said, it's gorgeous. What's the problem? They said, the bottom row are all the masters who taught. Every one of this, up to like a 30-foot room, are the final projects of the students. And by the time they were done, you couldn't tell the difference between that one and that one. That the best the Florentine instructors were able to do was replicate their own knowledge and their own abilities. And what happened is, for several hundred years, art advancement stopped in Florence because they feel they had done the best. It is our job to put out students that scare the hell out of us. It's our job to put out students that embarrass us with our old knowledge. It is our students' job to come back into their schools and say, this is what we need to teach now. And that's an amazing and scary obligation, but it is an obligation. And it's one that I hope we can take on together. So thank you very much for your time. I've taken up too much time, but I'm willing to hang around.
Will you take questions?
I would love to.
Okay. Anyone have questions, comments?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I sort of I wanted to rewind the conversation a little bit.
Sure.
Back towards the beginning. And first of all, you talked about knowledge as a conversation.
Yes.
And then secondly, if you give us the example of the escape example
Yes.
of identifying these links between Gwen Stefani and
Yeah.
separation. So I'm gonna look at the argument end of your
Okay.
suggestion and argue that is in fact not so much knowledge as a conversation, but it's information as a conversation.
Okay.
We are arguing, the escape example is something to do with knowing what Gwen Stefani did, rather than knowing how to do something. And I think the knowledge of the conversation is actually a much harder thing to achieve.
David, can you repeat Nick's question?
No. No, it's a question about what we mean by knowledge. And his argument is that wasn't knowledge construction, that was really information construction, that we were building different contexts. Fair?
Yes.
Yeah, and this is going to be definitional issues. And I have this personal belief that knowledge is a fractal concept. Fractals in mathematics, you can keep going deeper and deeper to infinite dimensions, right? So that anyone could write a dissertation about this cup if they wanted to, right? God only knows why they'd want to. And so we need to talk about, you can either go with Graham's taxonomy, in which you talk about things like data, information, knowledge, wisdom, right? And so, all right, so I would argue you're talking wisdom and I'm talking knowledge. But ultimately, what I would argue back to you in looking at conversation theory is that knowledge are the cognitive structures we have by which we are able to perform action, right? And so by understanding that context and how those things fit together in an agreement within my head, it's going to influence how I listen to Gwen Stefani next time, right? I wasn't seeking knowledge on how to create the next Gwen Stefani song. If I did, that scape might look radically different, and it may not even work well there because I can't sit there with keyboards and learn hands-on. I'm also very much convinced, I had a very good discussion, Batya Friedman, who's at University of Washington, is one of those frighteningly smart people in the world. And when we talked about knowledge management, her problem was, Dave, you assume that you can make all knowledge formal, that you can take tacit knowledge and make it formal. I would argue that you can't. That's her argument. I don't disagree. That it can't teach you the violin by watching other people play the violin, right? But we're able to teach people how to play the violin, so something is happening in an interchange back and forth, some of it technology mediated, some of it can never be technology mediated, that we're transferring at least our understandings of this that change our, what Pask would call a cognitive entailment mesh, other people might call a semantic network in terms of language, but it changes how we approach problems. So I don't disagree that when we look at intensity and level, there's a huge amount of nuance around the word knowledge. But I would argue that we would probably agree that just because I gave you a book doesn't mean that we created knowledge. So, but I'd love to have that conversation too as well. So, please.
Yeah, I wish that some of our first-year doctoral students were here. If they are, they're hiding behind the pillars. Because what you're talking about kind of intersects, like last week's seminar topic, this week's seminar topic, so at least the readings. Last week you're reading Pat Wilson's Two Kinds of Power. This week they're reading Howard White, Sperber and Wilson, Relevance, and Wilson on
situational knowledge. Yep.
And the whole idea of Sperber and Wilson about how do you knowledge being, knowledge creation being a conversation.
Yes.
And then White showing how you can sort of mobilize, let's say, bibliographic age,
Yep.
the bibliographic distributions of counts of things to function in a way to give us some approximation of what Wilson would say was the best textual means to an end,
Right.
which seems to be part of what you're saying that libraries ought to still be doing,
Yes.
providing the best textual means to an end, although we would extend it beyond Wilson's focus on text.
Yes, I'd say that's exactly right. The difference being that I think there's an earlier assumption of the neutrality of tools, that the form in which it happens is a relatively non-interacting part of that knowledge creation and such. And I would argue that it's that non-biased part of it.
Well, Wilson felt that that you could have a neutral listing,
Right.
even a subject-based neutral listing, as opposed to an exploitative, rankable
Yeah.
listing that was based on the understanding of the user's needs.
I would have a hard time with the idea of neutral. No, well, when God said this, I think he was wrong in the following things. I mean, it's clearly it's a pretty deep thought there. But it is one of those questions that we have, the neutrality of it, I mean, a lot of what I come from is complexity theory, talking about more or less infinite interacting variables, and any one of them can have significant impacts of a larger system. And so the color of the walls could, in fact, influence the discussion you had. The alphabetical listing, what do you do with the von in Von Dran? What do you do with the
Mack and McCain.
Right, right. And so neutral, right? If you do the Mack and McCain, you probably didn't come from Scotland at one point, too, because that Mack's important, right? Or the von in German, because that meant Baron at one point. So, it's the neutrality that's the problematic. But yes, the idea that we're constructing knowledge that way.
I want to ask you a question, but I want to precede it by saying I totally buy into your idea of evolving knowledge structures, because we were looking at some learning styles of millennial students last summer.
Excuse me,
And one of the things that came out very strongly was this concept of bricolage and the concept of an evolving context. So I wanted to ask you a question in the context of that statement, which is that I come from a background in organisational learning and change management theories. And through that literature, we have this concept that people learn through exemplars, in Kuhn's sense, exemplars as this sort of perfect object. And that isn't the Florentine concept of you stop there,
Right.
but you evolve the exemplar.
Right.
So what do you do with the objects? My question is, what do you do with the artifacts? Because they are the exemplars. These books.
Right, and this is... One could argue that libraries are book museums. We go visit them.
Yeah.
And we sort of appreciate them, and then we walk away from them. And I think we would all hate if that were true.
Yeah.
Right? And the idea being, we need to inform conversations, and artifacts are an essential mean by which we can inform conversations, and we can prolong conversations over time.
Yeah.
But what I worry about, and why I deliberately talk about the information and depreciate the artifacts, is not because I say, they're useless and burn them, let's get rid of them, but because I think sometimes we forget that because that has been the predominant means by which we communicate and disseminate, that we forgot we're in the knowledge business, and the interfaces can change. The idea of, oh my God, you got rid of the books. Part of the reason we're building those centers is so that, in fact, if we do get rid of the books in the new library, and people stand up and do the San Francisco thing, you got rid of the books, you've betrayed us, and whatever, we can have half a business community stand up and go, damn right they did, and this is why. Right? Not the librarian to stand up and do that, because if the librarian did their job right, that place, people walk in, they're going to go, yep, that's me.
But I suppose my question was really that as these books have some value, how do you integrate them back into it?
Oh, well, and in fact, one of the systems we did early on was an electronic reserve system. And the idea was if you look at the catalog, one problem I have with the catalog is you find a material and it's in isolation. And what we talked about is imagine now, as you drag things into your escapes and your conversations, sitting behind them are the books and the bibliographic data. I mean, they're there.
Right. So they're virtual objects.
Well, they're virtual objects in this sense.
Yeah.
But we talked about in a physical hybrid sense, you walk around with your RFID-enabled library card. I know they'll freak out. And as you walk by a shelf, it says, by the way, there are things in me you might like. Right? That is based on the social network and what happened in the electronic world. And we're faced with the real situation that we still have physical artifacts that we have to shelve, and we have to put them someplace. And the business librarian hates the fact that the cookbooks are in the business and industry section. And why? Because Dewey thought that home economics was an industry, right? But ultimately, as electronic means become more and more pervasive, and I can walk into this setting, you could put them in a sequential order, and I can organize them the way I want. And if I have delivery systems that I can get at, it minimizes the impact of how we have to put things. I mean, that's the big difference. Dewey was right with standardization of data and all this and having to standardize how you look at things because it fit the technology capabilities at the time. We have radically new technology capabilities right now. Not that technology forces us to do things. I think it allows us to get to a much more natural state of how we do things. So I think the way you integrate them is within a hybrid environment. You still need browsability, but I think that's where you talk about the community to set up what the browsing structures are, not single on large universal organizational schema.
I think that's really exciting. I'm interested that you still see this as a physical space.
Absolutely.
Because I see it as a virtual space as much as a physical space.
Oh, it's a hybrid environment, right? It's both. But the physical is important. I mean, a lot of what we called for in the original tech brief was to make our online environments more like our physical settings. Because libraries, if you look at the physical settings, they're pulling out shelves and they're putting in coffee bars and they're putting in places to hang out. And what we've said is you come to the library, you can't hang out. I mean, you can't, and hanging out doesn't just mean that's the social word again. I can't say, come over here, look at this, right? I can't say, you're cool, let's talk about this. I mean, literally the physical excitement of this guy's gesturing at me, I want to get away, right? We can't do that on our online sites. It was amazing. The Free Library of Philadelphia has 20,000 programs a year. Reading clubs, author speaking series, technology workshops, 20,000 of them. Find them on the website. They don't exist.
However,
Well, you know what the website is? It's a coral reef without the fish. It's the artifact. It's the structures and artifacts that were built from a social process, now divorced from the social process.
but I would argue that millennial students have created these spaces themselves, and they do actually.
And I would argue I would agree with you, and I would argue the reason they're doing it is because they're the pressure. They're coming and saying, I don't care what this structure is, I'm willing to create it. And I would argue that the same drive that's in the millennial students is in you and is in me. We've just had it beaten out of us.
Yeah.
You know?
Totally.
I really, we were the millennial students. Socrates talked about these damn kids these days and their arsenic. I mean, this idea that new tools and new capability, of course the young people, they have the time to address this stuff. And so I don't think they're fundamentally different. I just think that they have had more immersion in this than other folks, and we need to push that immersion up.
Let me say one more thing, and I'll see the book because I'm hogging it here. So how do we get them into that physical environment when they've already rejected it and created their own alternative?
I don't think they've rejected it. But if you walked into the Free Library on Sunday, it's packed.
Yeah.
I was here to go. I wanted to do some writing. I was in town. I couldn't find a table space in the Central Library. We had a meeting. And we lined up before they opened, and we were in line to get into the building. That's an amazing thing. Now, well, there are all different reasons there. Some are there just because it's a warm place. Some of them are there because it's a safe place. Some of them are there because it's a place. But a library is an aspirational community. And I think that there are situations where we don't need a physical space. And I think there's some we are. In the virtual reference, I was talking to one woman. She came up to me and said, we don't do virtual reference in a sort of embarrassed, sheepish way. I said, well, why not? She goes, well, we're a small, all-women's, Northeastern liberal arts college. And at 9 o'clock at night, all the students come over in their bunny slippers and pajamas to study. And I said, don't you dare offer virtual reference, right? But there are going to be many settings. I mean, you're doing distance education to reach a market, but there's a need there, right? There are going to be settings where it makes sense to only do it virtually, some to do it in only physical, and some in a hybrid. And my point is, the determination of that is not because what Google did, or, oh, we can do MySpace now, or let's follow this feature. It's because we've identified our community, we've worked with our community, and as a whole, we have determined these are the best means by which we can enrich this community. We need virtual tools. The Entrepreneurium has a virtual space to it where you do matchmaking and networking and you do LinkedIn type services, and that's envisioned as part of it. But part of it is, I'm a single mother, I want to start a company, I just need a place outside my house to sit down. That's a legitimate use of a public library. So.
I have a more technical question. I really liked the scapes images, and I would like to know how can that be implemented on a large scale? Is this a program you developed? How do you see the generalization?
This is a keynote presentation where I have pretty pictures. And our hope is, and we've been talking with folks within OCLC and others to develop it. I mean, I have a sense of how you would do it with using Ajax, or he wants to do Shockwave. But you know, it's an idea now that needs to become real. But part of the reason I bring it up is because someone's going to look at it and is going to say, that's a stupid icon. Or someone's going to look at it, I mean, this is the danger when you bring it up. But I found that I would rather get the this is a stupid icon question than, you know, a picture to start from. That's what this is. It's a picture to start from.
Behind, you know, the scenario you walked us through, I'm seeing, I think there might be some problems of how to connect all the resources. Okay, that's
well, I think, but I think that, in terms of the underlying stuff, I mean, you know, the idea of using RDF and semantic networks to bind them and using XML schemas to put them together, the idea of putting them into object-oriented databases that we can search by multifaceted systems. I mean, we know that stuff. I mean, that's my problem is we know that stuff, and then we say, and a MARC record will go here. And, you know, MARC, God help us, MARC. Hold on, let me do my time warp here. MARC, right? That you know, at least bring us up to the relational database world, you know? And so I think that you're right, there may be scaling issues, but I think they're addressable. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is PageRank, and Google certainly has managed to do it with a couple of billion things. One of the real worries that when I look at, say, the IR community got almost instantly sidelined when Google hit big. And the reason was Google walked into this IR community and said, you people are nuts. And the reason you're nuts is because you work with pristine corpus and data sets that are well structured. We deal with dirty data. And so what happened was, if these people didn't want to become irrelevant, and SIGI certainly has not, they all went around and said, you know what? Dirty data. That's our next challenge, and that's what we moved to. And so I think what we could do is doable. And I think it may be dirty, how we end up with it, and dirty data and such. But I think it's infinitely doable, and if we stop ourselves and think, what's the pristine data model in the ER diagram with every potential facet, I'd rather just build it and fix it as we go. In a participatory way, to have people say, this. I had a talk, Dr. Finhold from Michigan was talking, and he talked about the difference between sort of how computer scientists approach building a bridge and an engineer build a bridge. An engineer sits there and diagrams it, builds this huge redundancy, and then after like a 12-year process, they begin putting the, whereas a computer programmer says, all right, and they throw a bridge up in cardboard and it falls down. All right, let's try tinfoil. Tinfoil doesn't work, and they try plastic. Plastic doesn't work, and frankly, they may never get past plastic because the grant ran out. But, you know, I think we're at it's the same thing with curriculum. I think that sometimes LIS curriculum and accreditation has locked us into a model that we don't want to be locked into. And I think one of the major needs now, I think Michael Gorman was right that there are challenges in education, and he's exactly wrong about his solution, which was to standardize on cataloging all this. I think what we need to do is take our cores and throw them away. And I think what we need to do is half of our credits need to be experiential credits, and half of our credits need to be derived in real problems with real people. And we tinker. That because we don't know what the model is to train people in, we need to train people how to develop models. And that's a tinkering world. So that's a long way to go with that. But I would love for you to take on these challenges and work on that. Thank you all again very much.
just issue a big.
Yeah, I think they were recording this, and I've been recording as